How dispirited are people in Burma then? They've had years and years of trying to see if they could get change through peaceful means. We know about the protests when they did try. They were very brutally put down. Are people very fed up at this stage now about what's going on there, or do they take it very stoically and believe in time things will change?
I think nobody was surprised by the elections. I think people thought the process would be rigged and manipulated, and it was. So that wasn't, I mean, people were disappointed, but it was an expected disappointment. There was also a certain sense when Aung San Suu Kyi was released, a major sense of euphoria for people in seeing her again. And I was down at the gates of the house when that happened, and it was an amazing thing to see that people risked their lives to go down there. Not really the diplomatic community, because we knew we weren't going to get targeted, but
because they were warned not to go down.
They were well, no warning, but there were armed soldiers around,
yes,
and armed policemen around, and until the very last minute, and it was the departure of those troops that made everybody realise that she was going to be released. But they were there and they were nearby, so it was a very dangerous business to go down, but thousands of people went, and thousands of people turned up the next day to hear her speak. So there was a sense of joy that she'd been released, tempered with a fear that this could be yet another temporary release from house arrest, only for some pretext to be found shortly afterwards that to put her back under house arrest, and that still remains a big risk. You
were there, as you said. Fantastic moment to finally see her being released, but of course with a sense of anticipation that perhaps she'd be chucked back in again, because that has happened to her a number of times. You've met her several times since. Tell me a little bit about what she says about her I think 15 years or so under house arrest, that experience.
Yeah, she's incredibly stoical about it. I mean, remarkably so. And she sees it as this is a journey that she's embarked upon. And she's absolutely clear that she will continue to advocate democracy and to fight on behalf of the Burmese people until her last breath. So house arrest is a risk that she runs. And that was a risk she ran, and it turned out to be a reality. She dealt with it through a mix of meditation, listening to the radio, writing. In fact, you'd think it wasn't really too difficult. You know, it must be, but the way she talks about it, it's just, well, this is what I'm here to do. And if that's part of the price I have to pay, then that's the price I pay. Yeah,
I read some of the interviews she did afterwards, and she talked about, I think, radio was a huge thing in the World Service and listening to what was going on in the world, and I think she said she didn't have enough hours, there weren't enough hours in the day for what she was doing, and she had to learn to be, I think, a plumber, an electrician and everything else, because the house wasn't kept very well.
Exactly.
But does she have a great amount of freedom now, or is she still being followed around and monitored?
Well, she hasn't. She does. You can come and go freely from her house, and she can come and go freely from her house. I think, at the moment she has gone out a bit. She's held a lot of meetings at the NLD headquarters. She's out really listening to people now.
And she is able to go to those?
She is, and she's been... but a couple of times that she's been into public places, people are so keen to tell her how well they think of her and to wish her well, that there is actually a sort of massive crush which develops. It's like a rock star going out in many ways. And as a result of that, she's quite careful about where she goes. And I think she's also taking things quite slowly, making sure she doesn't give the regime an excuse, a pretext to rearrest her for, quote-unquote, her own security. So at the moment she's doing most of her operations from NLD headquarters and from her own house.
What does she hope to achieve? I know you're saying greater democracy, but you know, you wonder how is she going to be able to achieve that if this new political system has now been endorsed and put in place.
Yeah, no, it's the biggest challenge she faces. Her central belief is that the only way to resolve Burma's many difficulties and the divisions within the country which exist, quite apart from the regime, there are, as you know, ethnic groups that have issues around their status within the country, is through a process of a genuinely open, inclusive dialogue where all the parties concerned get together and try to find a way through. She's very clear the military can and should be part of that. They have a role to play. Her father was a general himself, and in many ways the founder of the nation and of the army. So for her, this is the first step, and she's said that she will do anything it takes, meet anywhere, meet anyone, in order to do that. The difficulty at the moment is that the government isn't interested. They say, we've set up a new parliament, that's the forum for this kind of debate, so what do you want, something outside?
Yes.
And it's going to be, she appreciates better than anybody else how difficult it will be to bridge that gap.
And what about outside intervention, Ambassador? We have, we know that China is a huge ally of Burma. Russia, there too, perhaps less so. People say that if China was to pull the plug on the Burmese military regime and say the game's up for you, that things would change. Is that true, or is it that simplistic?
Well, it would. I might be slightly oversimplistic, but it is certainly true that China's influence is very profound in Burma, and as a large country and a neighbouring state, that's
big ally.
Big ally. That's pretty inevitable. But there is no sign of China making that move at this stage, and we continue in the West, certainly from the UK perspective, from the EU perspective, to try to work with China to bring our different approaches together as best we can. But there is quite a fundamental difference of approach between the two.
And what is it like there for ordinary Burmese people?
It's incredibly tough. I mean, the focus is on the politics.
Yes.
And the big, the headline of Aung San Suu Kyi against the generals. And that's a big issue. But the economy is really in a desperate state.
It's one of the poorest countries in the world, isn't it?
It is. And certainly in Asia, it's way behind. I've travelled in the region quite a bit. You see countries like Vietnam and Thailand accelerating away, and Burma is just stuck. So economically, it's really tough for people. You've got child mortality figures of 1 in 5 kids don't make it to the age of 5. I mean, that's just 1 in 5. And the maternal mortality is, if you take Afghanistan out, way below anything else. It's at African levels, in the worst of African countries. This is because health spending is minimal, education spending is minimal. Life is, on a daily basis, really tough for people.
Except this is a country that's rich in resources. It has got oil and gas deposits. We know that the likes of the French are very much involved in doing business, the Russians too, other countries as well. It's got other resources like pearls, rubies, jade. So it is rich in resources. But the belief is that the benefits and the revenues from those industries go to the elite within the military regime, who are also involved in drug dealing as well.
Well, there are allegations of that. Certainly in the first
perception.
part, there's no question about the fact that the money from those industries that you've mentioned goes straight into regime hands and does not filter down into benefiting ordinary people, to the point that there now has to be a major aid effort from the EU, from the UK, from the US, Australia, are putting money in to just help people get through the day.
It's incredible, and they have that they do get revenues from these industries.
They do.
There's money coming into the country.
There's big money coming in. There's about 2.4 billion in gas alone coming in for the gas that they're exporting. So there is big money out there, but it's at the moment it's not filtering out of Naypyidaw effectively.
And is it very obvious that the elite in the military who are getting this money in are living high lives, that they are enjoying the benefits of such huge revenues coming in? Is it obvious?
Well, to be honest, Karen, it's not. If you're living in Rangoon, they're up in Naypyidaw, and you will see occasionally, I mean, the cars on the roads in Burma are of a certain age, and then suddenly you'll see this brand new 4x4 driving around, and you can usually know that that's going to be the grandson or the nephew or the niece of somebody senior in the regime. But no, a lot of the money is held up, from what we gather, is held up in Naypyidaw, but there is a famous video on YouTube of the Dan Shui, the current president's daughter's wedding.
Yes.
And if you look it up on YouTube, you'll see for example, the necklace she is wearing. I couldn't even start to put how many millions that must cost. So that's just one example of the ostentatious displays. But these ostentatious displays often, if this makes sense, go on behind closed doors within military circles. And
military have been accused of trafficking in heroin, or engaging in heroin trafficking.
There is that accusation out there, yeah.
And again, difficult to prove, I presume.
It is, yeah.
What about the allegations again that, well, they're not just allegations, there's clear evidence to show that the military have been involved in tremendous human rights abuses, particularly against ethnic minorities like the Shan, the Karen people, and that they have been engaged in child labour, that people have been killed in villages. I travelled and covered the situation of Burmese refugees living in these huge camps on the Thai-Burmese border, and I heard those stories time and time again. Is that sort of stuff still going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a real concern that it is, and there's certainly lots of evidence already that it's happened, and no great evidence that it stopped. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Mr. Quintana, went out to Burma, I think it was during the course of last year, and produced a report in which he recommended a commission of inquiry be set up to investigate these abuses of human rights. And that's been an interesting process because a number of Western countries, a number of EU countries, including Ireland and the UK, have backed this call for a commission of inquiry, because that's all it is at this point. It is a call for a commission of inquiry into these allegations. Aung San Suu Kyi has also supported it. The difficulty is it's a UN process, so getting agreement through the UN is going to be complicated, but the US are on board as well. So there is a drive now to get these allegations properly investigated. But the evidence is more than anecdotal evidence in some cases, but there is a lot of evidence out there to suggest that these allegations are true.
Can you actually travel into these places?
Some of them. There are some places that are off limits, but
yes,
it's quite a lot of the country I can see, but certain places, particularly the most sensitive ethnic areas, which is exactly where some of the abuses you mentioned have taken place, would be off limits.
Because the stories I was hearing was that the military would go into villages, we'll say of ethnic groups who were clearly not supporting the military regime, and they would take over that area, and if people were killed in the process, then they would consider that collateral damage, and then that area would become militarised. And I heard stories of people who had to work effectively as slaves for the military, and then they managed to escape through the forests. But very difficult, I would imagine. You know, it's very difficult to go into those areas if they're militarised.
We wouldn't be allowed into where that type of thing is going on. We'd be kept well away.
And this is the whole secretive element of Burma, isn't it? It's very difficult for journalists internationally, for example, international journalists, to go in there freely. They don't. They have to pretend that there's something else there, and to travel around and really get a sense of what's going on in that country.
Yeah, I mean, the journalists who've been in, and there have been a few recently who came in, particularly around the time of the elections, and I think the regime were keen to have the release of Aung San Suu Kyi covered in the world media, which they achieved. But they come in on tourist visas, which means if they do anything off the tourist track, they can be deported, as some of them have been. Just
before we go, you've been there for, it's coming up to 2 years now. Very big change from your position as you were in the British Embassy here. Do you think that the Burmese military regime are, of course they're aware of what the outside world thinks about them, and the condemnation from many states and the EU of the human rights abuses and everything else and the lack of democracy. Do you think they really care about what the rest of us think about them, or do you get a sense that, especially I suppose now with the events around the Arab world, that maybe they'll have to recognise that they can't really carry on in a dictatorial way anymore? Or is it the case that it's so secretive and they can get away with what they're doing, that they don't really care?
That's a good question. I think they do care about the outside world. I mean, the sanctions are, they're like all measures of that type. They have their weaknesses as well as their strengths. But one of the strengths that the sanctions regime has is that it communicates a very clear message about how they're viewed in Europe, US, Australia, and so on. And there are different regimes in different countries, but the message is clear. There are serious concerns externally about what you're doing. And that pariah status is something they do not feel comfortable with. That is certainly clear. Where you go with that, I'm not quite clear about, because I'm sure they would have been watching what's gone on in the Middle East and North Africa very carefully, and how they react to that is really difficult to call. Whether they'll view it as some meaning that they need to try to open the door we were talking about earlier on a little wider, a little quicker, or whether you just keep it slammed shut, because once you start to take the lid off, it could go down the same route. And it's really difficult to know. If you look at their previous behaviour, I think they'd be thinking keep things pretty locked down.
Okay, well, fascinating stuff. Andy Heyn, British Ambassador to Burma, thank you very much.
Thank you.